Te koto te whānau o Auckland Unitarians. Te koto nā manuhiri. No mai, higher mai ki tere whare karakia a te atua. Te tato, te kato katoa. A warm welcome to you all this morning. As we gather together this morning in this space made sacred for the last 114 years and 358 days by Auckland Unitarians, may we learn to recognize and affirm the pieces of possibility, the bits of good we bring. May we encourage rather than control, love rather than possess, enable rather than envy, allowing our individual gifts to weave a patchwork of peace. The soft deep blue of sensitivity and understanding, the red energy of creativity, the white heat of convictions, the risky, fragile green of new growth, the golden flashes of gratitude, the warm rose of love. Each of us is indispensable if we are to minister to a broken and wounded world. Together in our gathered diversity, we form the whole. So be it. This morning, I'm pleased to welcome as our guest speaker, Christine Hertzog. Wait for your hand. Christine grew up in Alaska, spent her formative years in San Francisco during the hippie era, followed by a university study in Boston. She came to New Zealand for 9 months in 1976 and got sidetracked in consideration of the possibilities arising from the Treaty of Waitangi. 40 years later, that is still her main preoccupation. This morning, we'll be looking at our relationship with Tangata Whenua, the people of the land. Most Unitarians in Aotearoa, New Zealand, are immigrants, or a generation or many generations removed from immigrant Te Puna ancestors. Some of us may have our lineage woven deeply into this country's whakapapa family tree, Aotearoa's family tree. Some of us have just begun, but what most of us have in common is that our comparatively privileged lives all too rarely touch the lives of Tangata Whenua. This reality does not honor our commitment to the first and seventh principles of Unitarianism. As a first step, understanding better the frequently misunderstood Treaty of Waitangi's definition of the relationship between Pakeha and Maori is a good place to start. Glenn Colquhoun, a Pakeha poet and physician who has lived intimately within the Maori experience, offers this poem that aptly describes how difficult good race relations are. My great-great-grandfather was from Lewis. This is a village on the shores of Loch Lomond. My parents hang us coat of arms on their wall. My great-great-grandmother was a Murray. She lived in Glasgow by the Clyde. I don't know if their families fought, but I wouldn't be surprised. Some Murrays live in Whangape. I guess we are related, except that I'm Pakeha, and they are part Te Rara. Somewhere along the line, I have managed to colonize myself. It's not the first time this has happened. My grandmother's grandfather is from England. This has been a problem for the Scots. I can't forget what I did to myself at Culloden, or what Edward Longshanks did to William Wallace in Braveheart. I still hate the bastard, which of course I am. And if that's not bad enough, my grandmother's grandmother is German, and so is my grandmother's mom. One half of me has lost a war, the other half has won. Even more complicated is the fact that my mother's father's family are Jacobs, which, if I'm not mistaken, makes us Jewish, who of course won't speak to the Germans. No one mentions they were from Tasmania. Sometimes I don't know how to live with myself. I am a civil war. The Australians fight the English and keep the Scottish happy. The Scottish fight the English, and then they fight themselves. The English are offended and won't speak to the Germans. This annoys the Germans, who of course annoy the Jews. The Pakeha think they own the place. The Maori want us all to go home. I would if I knew where that was. Sometimes it seems I'll never win. Sometimes I never lose. Now I'd like to welcome Christine forward. Let us give her a warm welcome.
O tuatahi he mihi nui ki a koto, he mihi poto, nā te mea ko hore hau I te kōrero I reo rangatira. Engari he mihi nui, nā te mea tino hare hau ki te haere mai ki te tautoko I a tātou mahi, me te Treaty of Waitangi. Nō reira hui hui ora mai tātou katoa, ke rārui tēnei tuanui, ke rotu I te maraata whae to tātou kaihanga, tēnā koto, tēnā tātou katoa. And that's saying that I want to give a large mihi. I unfortunately don't actually speak te reo, and so it's not a very long mihi. Some people feel that's a good thing because I usually talk too much. So in reo it gets quite focused. But even though it's short, wanting to emphasize that it is heartfelt, generally because I'm happy to be anywhere, anytime, when there's anybody at all interested in the Treaty of Waitangi, but in this particular case for some other reasons as well. The minute I received the invitation, the thing that jumped out at me was Unitarian, actually Rachel, even before Rachel, because it brings back such positive memories for me from those years in San Francisco. When the Unitarian Church, where I was involved in anti-war work and anti-racism work, and the Unitarian Church in San Francisco provided a sense that a church could be part of the solution. At the time, I wasn't familiar with the Paulo Freire maxim that if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. There's no neutral ground. But those ideas had been shared, and they struck me quite forcefully. And I certainly wasn't convinced about churches in general, but as you may know, the Unitarian Church in San Francisco provided quite a beacon of light and sanity and leadership in those areas. So that was really positive. Of course, there was the personal connection with Rachel. There also was, as Clay reminded me, an association literally with this building because my treaty work in the mid-'80s brought me in contact with the Auckland WEA, which is where I've been more or less based ever since. And it was before my time, but I understand when Kay Green was the community coordinator, we actually met in this building. Clay pointed out where the stairs are. And we just had our centenary a couple of years ago. When I look back at the history, sure enough, there it was about meeting in the Unitarian Church. So thank you for your hospitality. It's been a bit of a nomadic group. We're now out in South Auckland, but never having had any funds like ordinary community groups, and I'm sure aligned with the politics. We're very appreciative of that. So that was a nice association. And the other thing that came to mind is that it's not very often that I get to spend some time with people who, I presume to some degree at least, are here by choice. You may not have realized treaty was going to be the topic, but although I see 1,500 to 2,000 people a year in various treaty-related education activities, it's very, very rare that I'm with people who are there by choice. They're normally there because their employer said they had to be, or because it's some part of some curriculum that they have to attend. And it's slightly daunting having so many people in front of you so much of the time who really wouldn't like to be there. So I appreciate and acknowledge that as well. In some ways, 20 minutes feels like a really short time. In the early days when we did treaty work, we said it was a minimum of 2 weeks. If you wouldn't commit to 2 weeks full time, we wouldn't do the workshop. And then we compromised at 50 hours. And now it's basically we take whatever opportunities we get. So I thought today, Clay and I talked a little bit about what I might cover in this time. In some ways, I wish I'd heard the whole service first, because there's so many themes that have come up through the hymns and the things that people have said and the things that Clay said, any one of which could be a great jumping off point for this presentation. But not having heard that, I thought I would just say a few things about what the treaty is, and perhaps even more importantly, isn't, because for most people, they know more about what I would call myths about the treaty than the realities, although this congregation sounds as though it's a bit different from the general New Zealand public. And then the topic that was listed, what it might mean for individuals here and for the church. So what it is and isn't, again, I don't know how much you know about these things, but by definition in international law, a treaty is an agreement between sovereign peoples. For those of you from the US, you may know that that's why First Peoples have some dubious rights to casinos, but in some areas the US government does recognize this to some extent. But that is the definition. If it's not between sovereign peoples in international law, it's not a treaty. So here, the Treaty of Waitangi is between the hapu, which is groups of related Maori whānau that are recognized in Maori culture as being sovereign, although that's obviously not the word they would use, but they are also were recognized at the time by the British Crown as being sovereign, which gives us a better starting point than in some other parts of the world where colonization occurred. So it's between the hapu and the Crown. It's not between Māori and Pākehā. Māori are not a nation or a state, and neither Pākehā nor Māori are nations or states. That also means it's a political arrangement. And for those of you, I don't know if anyone was here in the 80s, active in treaty work, but certainly in those relatively early days, for those of us who aren't Māori, trying to come to grips with what the treaty meant for us, we got off on what in retrospect has turned out to be a slightly unfortunate path, focusing on the cultural issues. And treaty became characterized as a bicultural agreement, which it's not. Treaties by definition are political agreements, which means in effect they're about power and control and decision making. And some groups are beginning to develop some awareness around that. In some ways it's better if you never heard the early part, because it's easier to start from there. We're having to spend a lot of time working through the fact that it's actually not a cultural arrangement, which some people started with, as I said, in the 80s and 90s. It's unique, and I remember an English teacher drumming into our heads that unique means one of a kind. It's not relatively unique or sort of unique or anything like it. Unique means one of a kind. And the Treaty of Waitangi is one of a kind. It is now the only treaty in the world that was between the British as colonizer and an indigenous people that was meant to be voluntary and mutually beneficial. There was one other once in Africa, in the Kingdom of Sherbo, but that community doesn't exist anymore, so we're the only one. And for someone like me, having grown up in the United States, increasingly conscious of the issues around colonization, this has been really important to me in trying to think through the treaty issues for all their complexities and uncertainties and screwiness from the beginning, because that feels to me really important. In various parts of social justice work I've been involved in, there's no foundation, there's no place you can go which has a positive start, and the Treaty of Waitangi is that. Some people question whether it was truly voluntary, but many, many, many didn't sign for a variety of reasons. In fact, there may be more hapu that didn't sign than did, and so obviously if they were able not to sign, I would assume that it's voluntary. And clearly much evidence from both sides of the relationship that this was intended to be mutually beneficial. So for me, 1840 doesn't feel that long ago. Having grown up, lived in a house in Boston that was built pre-1776. So it feels quite doable to me compared to banging my head against a wall for so many years on issues around racism, poverty, homophobia, gender issues, and all the rest. It seems to me we should be able to make this work. If you're not familiar with the treaty, its purpose, from both the Crown's point of view and the hapu who are involved, was to give the Crown authority to set up a government which would control the misbehaving Europeans. So if you know much about colonization, if you know about colonization by European powers, by the British, this was a very, very unusual situation. I can give you chapter and verse of evidence about this. It's pretty straightforward in terms of the evidence, but it was, of course, very, very unusual. I think it's partly because they didn't know about the gold and some other things that were changing. But in any case, it was the British Crown feeling that they should take responsibility for, you might say, selfish reasons, in the sense they felt that if they didn't take some responsibility, it would blow up and they'd get dragged into something worse. But nevertheless, there was a clear sense from the beginning that this was not about taking things for Māori. In fact, there was a high regard by the British Crown for Māori. It was about, there are some Europeans misbehaving, and if we don't get them under control, things are going to blow up. And basically, what both parties wanted, why the Hapu agreed to that and wanted it, and why the Crown wanted it, was because they believed, both sides believed, that it was a mutually beneficial relationship, and that it could continue to be a mutually beneficial relationship, and they wanted to encourage and support that happening. And as Clay said earlier, if there's one word I would have to say about the treaty, it's not the articles, it's not the texts, it's not the legal cases, it's the relationship. And I think that sounds as though it fits very well with your philosophies. The phrase that jumped out when you were speaking, Clay, was the grow in harmony. I think that very much captures the spirit of what people were hoping for from the Treaty of Waitangi. Specifically, I want to emphasize, I don't know how many of you have actually read the document. When I say treaty, I always mean Māori text. I can explain why I mean that. But I think that's pretty well established now for most people working in this area, including the Crown, thank goodness. There's not actually much in the treaty for Māori or for Hapu. Basically, the treaty affirms what they already had, which of course is a good thing. But the idea of the treaty, which many people don't understand, is that it was really for the rest of us. The treaty was to provide a framework for the terms on which we came here. As you said, in the very early days, or such as myself, not that many years ago. It didn't happen, of course, but it does set a framework which I think is just as relevant today as it was then. And in fact, isn't that similar for my expectations now about people coming into our communities? It basically expected the people coming in to join with the local community, to be respectful of how they do things, their culture, and to be fair. And presumably those are things that we would all expect from people coming in now, and so it's not some weird thing that Māori expected and other people wouldn't. The qualifier that is what has gotten lost over time is that not only on the one hand do we have the right to come and be here, but on the other hand we have these responsibilities about respecting the authority of the Hapu. And that's basically the part that's gotten lost. For some people it's lost because they don't know how to action it, for other people because they've got no idea what the treaty's about, for other people because they never even think about the treaty. But to me it feels really, really important because certainly growing up in Alaska, I never thought twice about my right to be there. But as I learned more about how my people came to be there, more as you said in your commentary around the candles, more about the history of colonization in the United States, it loomed as a big issue in my life about what right do I have to be here, there, or somewhere else. And personally, I feel strongly I don't want my right to be based on might is right. And ironically, although that sounds like a pretty heavy sentence, in some ways democracy is might is right, that you don't have to worry about the people in the minority because the majority gets to do what it wants. I think some people might be having some second thoughts about that in the United States at the moment, but it's certainly, I think, something to be questioned about our attitudes to people in the community. And it's an argument, obviously, in favor of consensus decision-making, which is very much a Māori way of trying to keep everybody together, moving perhaps more slowly, but together forward, not leaving people out. So many people characterize the treaty as the first immigration document. And I forget now, I guess it's coming up to 40 years. I've spent a lot of time thinking about what that means for me as an individual living here and enjoying the right to be here, and what it means for our communities and for our country. And basically, I've come to the conclusion that we do have the potential for making this work here. I'm not convinced that it will, but I think it can, number one. And number two, I want to be really part of that, and it gives me a much more confident sense of who I am and why I'm here if we can work this out. What does it mean? Well, the thing I have said several times, it means we do have the right to be here, those of us who are not of iwi descent, as long as we respect those agreements. The trick, of course, is how do we respect those agreements in what today is called Te Ao Huri Huri, which covers a multitude of issues, the changing world. Because we aren't in the situation now that we were in 1840. For a start, in 1840, Māori outnumbered everyone else 75-1. A short 20 years later, it was 1-1, and now it's the other way around. It's sort of 4 or 5 non-Māori to every Māori person. Well, actually 5 or 6 probably. So how do we recognize, acknowledge, and act on both the situation where this agreement was made and the situation that we have today? Well, a couple of a framework, a couple of guidelines I'd suggest. In the earlier days, when we were doing treaty work, we felt that all people needed was a commitment to justice. And if they had a commitment to justice, we'd be able to work it out. Over time, I've changed my view about that and found that there are often people who have a passionate commitment to justice, but still get in some really odd places around treaty because they just don't know the basic story. So my first suggestion is that people find out what it's all about, rather than leaping in without realizing what you're leaping into. In some ways, it's very, very simple. It's about relationships, and we all know about relationships, what makes them work and what doesn't. But on the other hand, it's a huge commitment. I know in my life I've got far too many relationships already, I think, and my obligations to those relationships, taking on another big relationship, is a big ask. So finding out what happened, how we got from a very positive place to a place that isn't so positive, understanding those dynamics, and understanding how we benefit from those injustices. I don't know if you know, but the government acknowledges, for example, that over 90% of the land in this country was wrongly taken. 5% is still in Māori title, so there's only 5% in the land in this country that was fairly transferred from Māori to general title. So that means the odds that any of us are living, working, playing, worshipping on land that was fairly acquired is very, very low, and in Auckland, Tamaki, it's non-existent. So we're all benefiting from those injustices. I know, for example, I chose New Zealand over some other countries where I could have come because English is the dominant language, and that would be so easy for me. Well, it wouldn't be English if the treaty promises had been kept. So we're all benefiting for those injustices. In my experience, Māori don't blame us, which is extraordinary in my view. But just because it's a relatively peaceful, quiet relationship, it doesn't mean that it's enduring or sustainable, because it's too much one way, I would say. And so we have to engage with some of those injustices that have arisen. Ways of finding out more. We have free treaty workshops. If the congregation's interested, we can come do one free if you have 15 or more people interested. There's other ways. You can read, you can go on the internet, you can go to Waitangi, they usually have workshops and things there. There's a variety of ways to find a bit about the history. Not a lot. We sort of say a 6 to 12 hour immersion is quite sufficient, but just to get those things straight about it's political, not cultural, and that sort of thing. If that's already clear, then and you may, hopefully as a result, want to get into action. There's sort of 3 to 4 areas where we would suggest you might wish to commit. One is around equity for Māori, equity for Hapu, because if there isn't equity, we can't even have the conversation. You know, are the different parties still committed to making this relationship work? Well, how can we have that conversation if all the parties to the conversation aren't equally able to participate for any number of reasons? Another approach is about restoring Māori culture so that it is a normal, dominant, central part of New Zealand life. That's part of an equity issue. But I know treaty workers, we've looked at ourselves time and again as we realize we should have more hui at marae, which are more accessible to our colleagues, and yet can't even get ourselves onto the marae because we know so little about it. Now, there are mixed views about non-Māori engaging with Māori culture. It's a real risk of recolonization. But by the same token, if we can't participate in Māori activities, again, how are we going to be able to grow in harmony together? The third approach that some people take is looking at what in New Zealand is called usually cultural safety, kawa whakatū te hau, or overseas it's called cultural competence, which isn't so much engaging with Māori culture per se, but learning how we work with cultural difference. I've been watching, even in this congregation, there's lots of different cultures represented here, and if you look across age and gender and things like that, class, and have been fascinated with how you approach those issues, but a lot of people find that quite difficult or don't even notice the differences. So I think we need some ideas about how we work with those differences. And then some people think this is first, I'm not sure if I think it's first, last, or along the way, but the whole business of forming relationships with hapu. I, to some extent, am resentful that it falls on to communities to do this. The government should be leading the way, but for 100 and whatever it is years, 70 years, they haven't. And so I've sort of given up on waiting. I know that some churches have been involved, certainly lots of community groups. Some businesses, some government entities are beginning to realize that if we wait around for the national government, small n, I mean, to provide leadership, we'll be waiting perhaps too long. Something could go wrong. And so I think it's easier for communities to think about how to get into relationships with hapu than for individuals. I know as community workers we've struggled for this for years, not very effectively. But things like finding out who are the hapu in the area, what's their story, are they interested in having us engage with them at this point in time, what would be common interests. I always say getting into treaty relationships is a bit like courting. Don't just decide you want to be in the relationship and who should we sign up with. It takes quite a long period, I think, to work out that it truly can be a mutually beneficial voluntary relationship. And I think I'll stop there in terms of the things I was going to say, just reminding people that if you do decide to pursue this, just use your own life experience about what makes relationships work and what doesn't. And the classic mistake that so many people make is having done all the work to gear up to pursue a relationship with hapu, they forget the part about what's in it for the hapu. They put so much energy into getting themselves there that they've forgotten that a good start to a relationship is what can we offer to the relationship so that it can be mutual, not just a notion of will you do this or that or the other thing for us. So, I don't know, I hope some of that's new for some people. Hopefully it isn't totally new. I'm very welcome to respond to any of the comments I've made if you'd like. I'm happy to talk with people later and see what happens next. I just live in Grey Lynn, and I recognize several people here from various other activities, so I'm sure we'll bump into each other, even if we don't pursue it now.
Thank you, Christine. I'm hoping you might have some questions that you might want to, or comments, or whatever. John? Wait, can you wait for the mic? Hold it like that.
There have been huge issues in the media about Auckland's homelessness crisis and with the very positive role that one particular Maori community has played in at least drawing attention to the sort of thing that might be done. And then in the same context, there is discussion about issues of bringing in large numbers of immigrants without putting in place the necessary infrastructure. I mean, it seems to me that one is, if those people come in without any kind of requirement to make contact with the sort of issues you've been talking about, this kind of exacerbates the historical problems. In a context where actually if the Maori communities had been more closely involved, perhaps we could have had a few more of these sorts of things that were done in South Auckland.
Kia ora. Several things there. One, certainly Māori have been very anxious about large numbers of migrants coming, exacerbating the problem of lack of understanding and so forth. I would suggest that time has shown that doesn't need to be a worry, because recent migrants are far more engaged with treaty issues than people who've lived here for a long time, with Pākehā who've lived here for a long time. In community workshops that we offer, they're always disproportionately the majority of the attendees wanting to know what this is about, wanting to know what their responsibilities are, wanting to fit in as migrants do. I'm sure people here, some of you have had that experience. So certainly in the communities I work in, which is mainly South Auckland, there wouldn't be a sense of the problem is migrants coming in. In fact, the Māori culture about manaki, to care for other people, as you noted with the marae, is so strong that certainly that wouldn't be a traditional response. The community that I'm most closely aligned with, Ngāti Tamoho, they're a mana whenua in the group that's been there literally for centuries. Our contribution is to work on setting up a new housing development right in the heart of the city, which will be 500 new homes. And we're having a heck of a time dealing with council and government bodies, because we keep saying, no, we don't want to make a profit off affordable housing. And nobody believes us. We've done paperwork, we've made contracts and everything saying, no, we don't believe people should make a profit off affordable housing, and we're going to set the pace by, in fact, using part of our settlement to achieve this. So I do think it's a two-way street. Māori have things to learn from the Western world. The Western world has lots of things to learn from Māori. But certainly, as I would tautoko your comment, that at the moment, Māori are providing some of the leadership, at least, in addressing this issue. Kia ora.
Hi, thank you very much for a lot of food for thought. You mentioned at the end that it's really important that in terms of a relationship that, and let's say a relationship between our community here in Ahapu, that we must obviously look at what would be the advantage or benefit of that relation for the hapu. In your experience, what sort of models might there be? Because we as you can see, we're to my knowledge, there are very few, if any, Māori who are part of our community. So what sort of, what relationship, what would we offer, or what would hapu in this area find?
Great around acknowledging that, the makeup of the community, but also that the community has things to offer. You shouldn't just launch into this. We should probably have some further conversation. But for example, one thing that would be very much appreciated if they're still doing it, I don't know if it's on for this year, but for the past several years, Ngāti Whātua Kiorake at Bastion Point, for Waitangi Day, they've had a big community event. And they've always asked for volunteers to help make sure the event is litter-free. And how they support that happening for the wider community is they invite everybody to come to the marae for the evening before to find out what's happening, everything. So that means you're getting an intimate experience where you're contributing to what they care about. They're sharing their culture with you. You do a litter thing, which is presumably a nice screen thing to be doing. And I'm sad to say that so few tauiwi, so few non-Māori take up that invitation that they'll remember you. They'll notice you just for that thing of giving up an evening. Well, you don't have to go for the evening thing. That's meant to be a treat. But for giving up one day of being at a community event that you might want to be at anyway. So there's a really simple little thing. Looking out for activities that they're organizing or have shown leadership about or something or other, and just going along and have a look-see and contribute. In a broader scale, and I noticed, Clay, in your opening about using te reo, just going along to a course, not necessarily becoming fluent in te reo. I mean, I've been doing this for years now. I'm still not fluent, as I said, but practicing your pronunciation, dropping words in where they naturally fit, not showing off, of course. Māori have always said to me, just check your heart. As long as your integrity is true and pure, give it a go. Because how is te reo ever going to become a normal language in this country if we don't use it? And there have been arguments about tauiwi shouldn't, but certainly there's a strong argument that if tauiwi, non-Māori, don't use te reo, it will die because there are not enough people who are able to speak. So there's free night classes at schools. We have a whole list on our website if you want other ideas, but being seen to speak up around media articles, whether if you like acclaiming the positive ones or if you like challenging the negative ones, so that, isn't that an amazing thing about Māori providing some leadership about the housing? It can be like that if you don't like doing the negative. Finding out the history of your own area. So there's lots of, we have a whole page full of ideas of things that don't cost more than $50 and wouldn't take more than 50 hours of your time, that if individuals did those things, we'd feel the difference. I know being in the Ngāti Tamoho community, they never ever comment on people who pronounce te reo wrongly. They always comment on people who pronounce it correctly, and that's because it so rarely happens. They still go for the intentions, but it doesn't seem like such a big ask to say that we would pronounce things properly, especially people's name and place names, things like that. So don't want to make it too big and complicated and we all get paralyzed. Just some little things. People are free to contact me. Clay's got my email. If you're wondering about something in particular, is this a good idea? Is that not a river? Just contact me.
Christy, what's the website?
The website that's probably most relevant is TRC, which is Treaty Resource Center, trc.org.nz. And it's really interesting. Are we winding up now? Well, I'll just close with what I think is a lovely story. The Auckland WEA, when we had our centenary, we looked around, and unlike you, we didn't have enough young people involved. And decided that although the work was still needed and people still wanted to do the work, we did not have enough people willing to take on the governance and management roles, which are increasingly required in community groups these days, and so we decided to shut down. Because we're a charitable group, we had to decide who to give our assets to. And we looked around, and we happened to be taking advantage of the hospitality of this Māori Ropu, Ngāti Tamoho, having a meeting at their venue. And we said, well, these guys are great. Why don't we offer our resources to them and see if they want them? And so we gave an inventory of all our resources and said, what, if anything, of these things would you like? And some of it was cash, some of it was intellectual property. There were different kinds of things. They took it all extremely seriously and had several meetings. Interestingly enough, not about do we want these things, but about can we care for these things properly. And after much discussion back and forth, they decided that they were interested in everything, including the Treaty Resource website. That's why that's mentioned, and the workshops and so forth. And so we came together to formalize this arrangement. Now, some of us, people like me have been working there 30 years, some of us were quite sad at the idea that the WEA was dying, and on our watch, all these people over all these years that had kept it going for 100 years, and we were the ones giving up. What was the matter with us? But we felt it was inevitable and had resigned ourselves. When the chairperson of Ngāti Tamoho stood up to speak, he said, I've heard you talk about this is shutting down the WEA, this is the end of the WEA. I just wanted to say to you that this is not how we see it. We see it that your whakapapa is being woven into our whakapapa. And that was such a gift for us, number one. And later, as we sort of got over it all and we're thinking more about it, we decided, well, that's the ultimate treaty relationship. There are still opportunities to join into the community. So I'm not saying that that's what you should do by any means. This was a result of a long thing. But coming from the US, I feel so privileged that here we are still talking. I certainly was in black communities in the United States where it didn't matter what you were there for, there was no communication that could happen. We are still talking here. Most New Zealanders have a sense of fair play. Most Māori are still hoping to make this work. So I think we can do it. And a group with a philosophy like yours, I'm sure, could play a key role in that. So thank you for the invitation. And I appreciate this opportunity to find more about this beautiful church. So thank you.
One little footnote about all that is our first minister, William Jelly, was the president of the WEA for some time and used to teach English literature in it downstairs. And they were here for 20 years. So if the WEA is being wrapped up into the whakapapa, we have been wrapped up into it. So we already have some ties to all of that. Thank you, Christine. That was very informative. For my closing words, what does it mean to bless? To bless does not mean saying magical words, changing the mind of God, or altering the course of the cosmos. To bless does mean reminding each other of our gifts, remembering the wisdom that is within us, and recalling our common purpose. The choices we make and the work we do are how we bless each other and the world. May the words we say and the songs we sing name the wholeness we are and still yet seek.